everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for a video. Last week I discussed alliances that were formed between Muslims and Christians during the era of the Crusades. I'm following that up this week by discussing another topic related to the Crusades, the culture of the people who lived in the Crusader states. The Crusader states were all founded by the leadership of the First Crusade, who against all odds captured a large swath of coastal territory in the Levant. People of European Christian descent maintained some degree of control in the region from 1097 all the way until 1291, so you had generations of people growing up there in an environment that was very different from Europe. This resulted in the creation of a unique culture among the people who inhabited these Crusader states. To discuss that unique culture, we're going to look at four primary source documents, sources written by people who experienced Crusader culture firsthand. In other words, these documents are all written by people who lived during the era of the Crusades and who were writing about their own experience with Crusader culture one way or another. So, to begin with, let's look at a document that was written by Folker of Chartres. He was a priest who went on the First Crusade, serving under Baldwin I of Jerusalem, who founded the county of Edessa during the First Crusade, and then became the king of Jerusalem in 1100. He wrote an important chronicle that is one of our key sources for understanding the events of the First Crusade. Folker did not return home after the Crusade, but he remained in the Holy Land for the rest of his life. As he was near the end of his chronicle, he wrote the following that gives us a lot of insight into how culture of people was changing even during this first generation of Crusaders. I ask you to consider and think in your mind about how in our time God has moved the West to the East. For we who were Westerners have become Easterners. He who was a Roman or a Frank in this land becomes a Galilean or a Palestinian. He who was of Reims or Chartres has now become a man of Tyre or Antioch. Some have taken wives not only of their own people, but Syrians or Armenians, or even Saracens who have obtained the grace of baptism. People use the eloquence and idioms of diverse languages in conversing back and forth. Words of different languages have become common property, known to each nationality. You see, therefore, that this is a great miracle, and one which the world ought to admire. So, Folker is noting that by the 1120s, there's already been a major cultural shift among the Crusaders. Many have intermarried with local Christians. Many now see their home not as in Europe, but in the cities of the Levant. Many have learned the local languages and can converse in them with the locals. Folker sees this as an important transformation and a very good thing, even a miracle, as he puts it. Again, remember, Folker is someone who came from Europe on the First Crusade and stayed in the Holy Land. And he's documenting this transformation of culture firsthand. In short, this document tells us that there is a syncretic culture being created in the Crusader states that combines elements of European Christian culture with those of locals. The next source I want to look at also comes from a chronicle, but not from someone who went on a crusade. It is written by an Anglo-French theologian and chronicler named Ralph the Black, who recorded his reaction to a visit from Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Heraclius was the head of the church in the Crusader states, and he went on a tour of England and France after Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187 with the purpose of recruiting people to go on crusade. So right around 1190, this is how Ralph describes him. He says, "He was clothed in a garment decorated in gold and silver, spoke with a strange accent, and was redolent with perfumes. I saw his cloak, a cloak the likes of which I had never seen in the West, so precious was it. To be sure, no patriarch in the Western world would keep a similar accoutrement. He has grown wealthy from Eastern riches and become Eastern in dress, conduct, and accent." So Ralph gives us a pretty clear picture about the different culture of the residents of the Crusader states. He wrote this around 1190, about 60 years after Folker's description of the residents of the Crusader states, and it seems that the gap between the culture of European Christians and those living in the Crusader states has widened. Ralph seems to be surprised that Heraclius' culture isn't the same as his. He notes that he resembles an Easterner as a result of the way he dresses, speaks, and behaves, and that makes some sense, given that Heraclius is in fact from the East. But for Ralph, this seems to be a bit of a shock. Next, let's look at a letter written by a famous 13th century preacher and priest, Jacques de Vitrie. Jacques spent most of his life in France. He was born there in 1160, he was educated at the University of Paris, and his preaching tours were all within French territory. In 1214, all his hard work paid off, and he was finally appointed as a bishop, something he was very excited for. However, his post would not be in France or even in Europe, it was in the Holy Land. Appointed the new Bishop of Acre, he arrived in the city in 1214, and he wrote a letter back to colleagues in Europe that tells us a lot about how an outsider views the culture of the Christians in the Crusader states. He wrote, "The descendants of the first generation succeeded to their father's property, but not to their good morals. They squandered the worldly wealth their fathers had won by the shedding of their own blood. They have become effeminate, addicted to unclean and riotous living, and dress like women in soft robes. They make treaties with the Saracens and are glad to be at peace with Christ's enemies." Anytime I read this letter, I always get the feeling that Jacques is experiencing some very serious culture shock upon arriving in Acre. He really seems to have expected to find people living in Acre who were just like him, but just happened to be living in the Levant. Instead, he finds people who are markedly different. When he calls them effeminate and, quote, dressing in soft robes, end quote, Jacques is really utilizing some age-old stereotypes that Western Christians use to describe people living in the Eastern Christian Byzantine Empire. So, like Ralph, Jacques finds that these Christians are more Eastern than Western, and that's exactly what Fulcher said was happening to the Crusaders way back in the first generation. It's also notable that he can't believe that the residents of the Crusader states are at peace with Muslims or that they signed treaties with them at all. As we saw in the last video, there were lots of military alliances between the two sides, but there were also frequently peace agreements between the two sides, and Jacques is very clearly appalled by that. So far, all the sources we've looked at have come from a Christian point of view, but the last primary source I want to show you today was written from a Muslim point of view. In particular, it's an anecdote that appears in the writings of USAMA ibn-Munqidh, a Muslim noble who worked for various Muslim rulers in the region as a diplomat, and he was regularly sent to the Crusader states. He wrote a memoir called Kitab al-Itibar, or in English, The Book of Learning by Example. Because he was so closely involved with the Crusader states and the Muslim rulers of the Levant, his memoir is filled with his interactions with people in the Crusader states, and there's one in particular I want to share with you now. He writes, "Among the Franks there are those who have become acclimatized and have associated long with Muslims. These are much better than the recent comers from the Frankish lands. Here is an illustration. I dispatched one of my men to Antioch on business. There was in Antioch at the time a powerful man named Theodoros Sophianos, who is my friend. One day he said to my man, 'I am invited to a meal by a friend of mine who's a Frank. You should come with me so that you may see their fashion.' My man related in the following words. I went along with him, and we came to the home of a knight who belonged to the old category of knights who came with the early expeditions of the Franks. He had been by that time retired and possessed an estate in Antioch on the income of which he lived. The knight presented an excellent table with food, extraordinarily clean and delicious. He saw that I was afraid to eat the food and said, 'Eat, be of good cheer. I never eat Frankish dishes, but I have Egyptian cooks and never eat except their cooking, and pork never enters my home.' So here we're not just seeing that the Crusaders are becoming more Eastern. In this case, the host of the meal seems to have adopted some aspects of Muslim culture specifically. He enjoys Muslim food and observes the Muslim practice of abstaining from eating pork. This particular case is no doubt highly exceptional. It was a surprising story even to USAMA, who had many dealings with the Crusaders. But it does illustrate that the residents of the Crusader states are combining their own culture with those of local peoples, something we've seen reflected in the 3 other documents we looked at today as well. So overall, I hope these documents show you that Crusader culture developed into something unique. Something so unique that people like Ralph the Black and Jacques de Vitrie are shocked at seeing what Crusader culture is like. This unique culture was also reflected in artwork and architecture produced by the Crusaders, but that's a topic for another video at another time. In next week's video, we're going to move away from the Crusades for at least a little bit, and we're going to look at relationships between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages, and in particular, we're going to talk about allegorical representations of the church and synagogue, as they often appear on Gothic cathedrals, and what they can tell us about how Christians think the relationship between Jews and Christians should be. That's it for today, though. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos on this channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to watch the first video I did on the Crusades, you should see that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching.